Yo guys, welcome to the video. This is Milky, and in today's video I'm going to make finally a build guide for the Falling Thunder. Obviously I've made a sequence of videos on the evolution of this build over the early access as we've had patches, new discoveries, new unique items found, and this is the version that I'm settling on and I'm going to keep min-maxing. There are things that I've looked at that could be otherwise good additions to the build, but if that does happen, I will of course let you know. But as of right now, this is a very good final point to introduce the build guide in terms of its full form, and I'm going to try and keep it in and around 20 minutes. I don't want to do a super long video. This isn't going to be a TED talk. I'm just going to go over the key things you need. There is a builder in the description, and I will update the max roll guide to this version of the build. I was tentative to do so as I am using an amulet that costs a few divines, but it is not 100% necessary. After feedback from people in my chat, the build functions perfectly fine without this amulet, so I'm very happy to convert the version over to this. So let's get into the build. The build that you've just seen was the Falling Thunder Invoker Monk, and it involves generating a ton of power charges to slam the ground with our Falling Thunder and send out tons of projectiles that will off-screen all the mobs, causing proliferated explosions with Herald of Ice, Herald of Thunder, you name it, and it boasts very good single target damage. I've been able to kill the Breach boss on the highest tier, which has just over 30 million HP, more than capable of doing those things, and this is by no means the end for this build. I plan on min-maxing this thing to the moon. I love doing that with my builds, so this one I will take all the way. So if you're someone that likes to stick to one build, this could be one for you, because I plan on taking this to the very, very limit and engaging in the crafting system and trying to make good items, if you want to call it that. So let's get into how the build functions after all that waffling. Falling Thunder is a slam skill. It's a lightning skill that fires projectiles when you consume power charges, and it also deals a significant amount more damage for each power charge consumed. This, as I mentioned, allows us to off-screen mobs, but it does pose an interesting problem. How do we generate power charges in Path of Exile 2? They're very different than Path of Exile 1, so generating them is also going to be different. And we've had many different methods that I've showcased over the past 2 weeks, but the one that we've settled on after all the rounds of buffs and patches and discoveries is Combat Frenzy. What this skill does is it says that you gain a frenzy charge when you freeze, electrocute, or pin an enemy no more than once every 1.65 seconds. You can combine this with the quality on the gem, which unfortunately isn't in the game, but it does work. You get 20% chance for additional frenzy charge when this activates, and you can also use the Profusion support gem to gain another 50% chance to gain another charge. So we have 70% chance to gain an additional charge, let's say on average 1.7 charges per proc, which means about 1 frenzy charge every second, assuming we are freezing, electrocuting, or pinning an enemy, which we'll get into in a second. But first of all, I'll answer the question, frenzy charges are not power charges, Milky, have you lost your mind? And my answer to you is the Resonance Keystone located in the monk area of the passive tree, which causes any frenzy charge you gain to be converted into power charges. This is going to be how we take all those frenzy charges that we generate and make them power charges that we can then consume to fire off our giant attacks. So that's the source of generation, but we also need to electrocute or freeze enemies. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we're going to need the electrocute gem to start with in order to be able to electrocute. This causes my skill to be unable to shock. Instead, it builds up electrocute. We're going to have this on Tempest Flurry, as we can start our initial chain of generating power charges just by hitting the mobs with Tempest Flurry. It's the scariest part of the map. The first 3 seconds, it's over in an instant. You activate your charge staff and you're good to go. So that's going to take care of that. But once we have our charge staff activated, you'll notice that it will hit enemies before we do, which is a bit of a problem because we can't have electrocute in 2 places. And if we don't have it on Tempest Flurry, how do we get our initial power charges? Well, my answer to you is we want our charge staff to be able to freeze, and to do that we use cold infusion. This takes all of your damage and adds 25% of it as cold damage. That's going to give us a good chance to be able to freeze the mobs. You can also add in sources of freeze buildup on the tree, which we absolutely will, but you'll see that it does nerf our damage a little bit. Our average damage per use is 4.6 with cold infusion on, and without it, it's 4.9. So a little bit of a debuff to our damage, but overall, the generation of freeze is much more valuable than any of that, 9% more damage on specifically charged staff would do for us. Ice Bite is also a good combination, as when you then freeze the mob and defeat it, you will gain another 35% damage as cold, meaning it's much easier to freeze the mobs because you're dealing even more cold damage. So you can see how the sequence kind of builds together and allows us to generate a ton of power charges. But that isn't necessarily going to be enough. You are going to want some source of cold damage on your gear, and the sources of that are going to be your weapon, your rings, and your gloves. You don't need maxed out rolls on all of them, but you do need a decent amount in order to be able to freeze. And remember, because Cold Infusion takes a sum of your total damage and adds it as cold, just getting increased damage anywhere is going to give you more cold damage on this skill and make you able to freeze. That could be sources like increased damage from the passive tree, more critical hit chance, so that you're obviously critting more and then those crits are going to deal more damage. Also, duels with additional damage. There are many ways to increase your cold damage outside of getting exclusively cold damage, but you do want to look for it on a couple of pieces. Now, should this fail you, there is a fallback option that I would be rude not to mention, and that is the 3 Dragons Solid Mask. It is a pretty weak helmet in terms of its stats, but it grants a very important effect. It causes our lightning damage to contribute to freeze buildup instead of shock chance. Now, this allows all our skills to be able to freeze much easier, as these are mostly lightning skills and deal a significant amount of lightning damage, especially when we have the buff from Charged Staff stacked at 7 power charges. That's going to be adding a lot of lightning damage, and you're going to find it very easy to freeze the mob. So on low levels of gear, it's more than reasonable to throw on a 3 Dragons Mask just to get going. And I will mention on 3 Dragons that I've tested this with Tempest Fury. Obviously, Electrocute does say that it cannot inflict shock, and this does say instead of shock. But despite these things feeling like they would nerf each other, they don't. You can still Electrocute with Tempest Flurry, and you can still freeze with Tempest Flurry. So absolutely fine to throw on 3 Dragons, and you'll have a significantly better time if you have low amounts of damage and cold damage by using this helmet. Now, the final piece of the puzzle is, of course, Falling Thunder, and having all this cold damage. Because Falling Thunder hits so hard, you can see my cold damage here is close to 2.1k average. Well, that's just a lot of damage, and that's of course without the more damage per power charge consumed, more damage if a power charge was consumed, so we double it and then we get this more multiplier on top. This cold damage is going to be enormous, so this thing is going to freeze pretty much regardless. We don't need to assist this with cold infusion or anything like that. This thing is going to freeze most of the time as well. So as soon as you start using Falling Thunder, you're going to at least pull back some power charges just from the cast alone, because you're going to freeze mobs. So that is how the engine for the build works. Let's talk about the rest of the support gems on the skills. Tempest Fury is our main attacking skill. It is able to be swapped out with Ice Strike. I know a lot of people like that skill. I think this skill is significantly better than Ice Strike simply due to its rate of attacking, especially when we're using it with Charged Staff. So we're going to get more shockwaves. We're going to proc our Tempest spell more often. But if you really want, you can use Ice Strike. I know a lot of people ask me that. You can do it if you'd like to. But in terms of support gems, we're using Lightning Infusion, Electrocute, Martial Tempo, Inspiration, and Rage. These are socketed in the order of which I would cut them if you don't have the additional links. And if you need up to a certain number of links, I will mention it. Falling Thunder, we use Perpetual Charge, Long Shot, Ricochet, Ambush, and Acceleration. Now, there are some very important choices here. The support gems on this skill are probably the most interesting of the whole build. We'll start with Perpetual Charge. This gives us a chance not to remove charges, but still count as consuming them. So we get to basically attack twice with our 7 charges in a row and deal tons of damage, which is obviously a huge benefit because we don't have to then wait a few seconds to gain all those power charges back. It's very nice to have. Long Shot is just more damage, of course. Ricochet makes those indoor maps feel so much better, as your projectiles are just going to start bouncing off of walls and hitting everything. And projectile skills in this game do have inherent shotgun, so these things can hit the same mob multiple times. Ambush, also very important because of the long range on this skill and its ability to just wander off and hit things. Mobs are typically going to be on full life, so doubling our crit chance against mobs means if we reach 50% crit, at least for mapping, we're going to have 100% crit on all of our Falling Thunders, assuming, you know, we haven't already hit the mobs. So this support gem is very, very good on this particular setup. Then we have Acceleration. This is just kind of the feel-good factor. It feels so good to just fire it off and your projectiles zoom away. You could obviously swap this for more damage. Try with and without, but honestly, the more projectile speed just feels so nice to play with. I don't think I'd swap this. I did briefly, and when I put it back on, I was kicking myself. I can't believe I ever played for more than a few maps without this support gem on. Now, Charged Staff is our buff skill. We can consume power charges to gain additional lightning damage and add a shockwave to our attacks. As I mentioned, this is going to be how we're freezing mobs, and you only need to tap the button once every minute and 10 seconds. Once you have the duration, and you have 7 charges, that's it. Every 1 minute and 10 seconds, you just need to do a bit of upkeep, and the rest of your power charges can be spent on Falling Thunder. Cold Infusion and Ice Bite, Already spoke about these to add the cold damage to the skill. Innovate means that when we kill the shocked enemy, we gain a big chunk of added lightning damage to all our skills, all our attacks, not just this socketed attack. And then Primal Armament gives us a bit more damage on this. Getting that 25% more weapon elemental damage does obviously scale our cold damage on this skill as well. So getting to this is going to be a big boost in your ability to freeze mobs. I'd actually say that it would be in this order that I would socket these gems. Now, Tempest Bell, the single target MVP of this build, this thing does an enormous amount of damage when you place it under a boss. It also allows you to kind of freeze and electrocute and do all these things much faster on single targets. And it's how we're able to defeat the pinnacle bosses so easily. We just keep placing our bell down, whacking it. We get 25 hits on this thing to do a massive amount of damage. You can see the shockwave does 204% of our attack damage, but then it also gains 30% more damage per elemental ailment. And we do chill, we do freeze, we do shock, we do electrocute, and we can, with a source of fire damage, ignite. It's not typical, we don't do it all the time, but it can happen. And that's why this, you've probably seen videos of people deleting bosses on Invoker Monks. This is why Tempest Bell is incredibly strong. On this, we have Conk Effect, Overabundance, Close Combat, and Rage Forged. The reason Rage Forged is on this is when you're playing the Falling Thunder build, normally, you're not actually hitting things with your Tempest Forge, so you're not generating the rage. But in a single target setting, you are going to hit the boss, you are going to generate rage, and then you can put Rage Forge down for that 35% more damage. Now, auras or buff skills, whatever you want to call them, we have two Heralds, Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ice. We have Blind, Lightning Mastery, and this should be Maim. Don't know where my Maim gem is, I am sorry. Combat Frenzy with Profusion and Cannibalism. Wind Dancer with Pin, Lockdown, and Windwave. Herald of Ice with Shock Siphon, Magnified Effect, and Cold Mastery, and then Grim Feast with Clarity. You can drop the Cannibalism and Clarity, that will set your spirit requirements to 150, which you can do quite easily as an Invoker Monk. You gain 100 from completing the campaign and doing the side content, and then you also gain some based on the amount of evasion or energy shield you have on your chest. You can buy a chest that gives you like 100 additional spirit, which would be 1,500 evasion rate for like 2 exalts. So this should be very easy for you to achieve. Just make sure you've done the necessary quests in the campaign to unlock that additional spirit. Now, Grim Feast, you may be thinking, is an interesting choice, but during mapping, what it does is it means whenever we kill a mob, we can pick up a mote that gives us energy shield up to 115. Now, this can actually double our ES because it overflows. And combined with the node on the tree that gives us additional energy shield when we consume a power charge, I'm going up to like 2.4k energy shield in maps when I'm running around, giving me a pretty comfortable health total, one that I'm happy to use. And the reason I use this over Ghost Dancer is simply Grim Feast is going to give you more max hit against those one-shots, which is typically all you die to. Ghost Dance is nice at recovery in ES, but Grim Feast is actually going to maybe help you survive a one-shot because it's actually increasing your total health pool. Eventually, we'd like to get more ES, but as for right now, I only have about 1,000. Hopefully in the future we'll get more. But obviously, if you are running the 3 dragons setup, you are going to have significantly less ES. And then maybe you could think about throwing on Ghost Dance. So that's the support gems. Now let's talk about the Ascendancy. The Ascendancy, of course, we are an Invoker Monk, and we do gain access to Protect Me from Harm, meaning that we get all of our evasion rating applied to our armor, but we do get less evasion rating as a result. But that's absolutely fine because we can still build a ton of evasion rating. The idea for doing this is to get a chest with as much evasion rating as you can, and life, of course. Mine's pretty bad right now. You can get upwards of 2k and still get life on it. And when you combine that with this node on the tree, 100% increased evasion rating from equipped body armor, we end up getting really good evasion totals. I have 78% chance right now. I have dropped a few evasion nodes like escape velocity and freedom of movement. But if you wanted to be tankier, look how close we are to nodes that would considerably increase our effective HP. You can easily drop damage if you have good gear to grab these nodes. Things like mindful awareness, immaterial. You could even come down and grab escape velocity. It's only 3 points away, and you do get a bit of movement speed as well. So I'm happy on this total. Now for the rest, we do go with Sunder My Enemies. Critical hits ignore non-negative enemy monster elemental resistance. And as I mentioned with Ambush, we only need 50% crit to reach an effective 100% crit, at least on our Falling Thunder. To achieve this, you do need to all the crit nodes on the tree that I have shown here. Also, you could come up and grab Critical Exploit by dropping this area. I also have Anointed Tainted Strike on my Amulet, which is down here. And I have critical hit chance on my helmet and some jewels. So you're going to need to invest into crit. And the only reason I need to invest so heavily into crit is because it's very hard to get a high DPS weapon with attack speed and crit. Now, if you could get a good DPS weapon with some attack speed and crit, it's going to make life really easy, and you're probably going to be able to pull back a lot on crit on the tree, or maybe even your jewels, or maybe even your anoint. But as for right now, this is where I've settled on because I simply need it to reach crit. I think I only have 48% crit right now because I don't have that roll on my weapon. Also, on weapons in this game, the critical damage bonus on weapon suffixes specifically is a more multiplier. So eventually our dream weapon would look like percent fizz, flat cold, attack speed, crit chance, crit damage. That is obviously a dream, a daydream. That might not be happening anytime soon, but just so you get an idea of how far off of perfect we are, given this 66% roll could be 176. The cold damage could almost go up by 1.5 times with the top roll. We could have 40% more damage from crit damage, and we could obviously have 5% more base crit. So just from the weapon alone, we're a long way short of perfection. So what happens then if we gain all that crit is that we are going to be completely ignoring the enemy's resistance. We're going to be hitting way harder, and that's going to help with things like freeze, of course. If we're hitting way harder, then we're dealing more damage to the enemy's elemental threshold, and we're going to freeze more consistently. And finally, we have I Am the Blizzard, which is another 10% of damage as extra cold damage, which again is going to help us get those freezes. But this is not necessary at all, as I've shown with the 3 dragons. You don't even, or I have way overkill cold damage at this point. I'd be freezing with probably half the cold damage I have, but more is never worse in this situation. It no longer matters if we're literally freezing and shattering every mob. The tree itself will be linked in the planner. There are a couple of decisions that you can do differently than I do. Of course, this cluster right here, you could restock it up to 1 with the river. That'll give you more freeze build-up to make it easier to freeze. Also, for some reason, I have a point here and not here. Don't know what I'm doing there, but you shouldn't do that. I have no idea why this is like that, but it is. You also, this area right here is questionable. If you don't have good jewels, then you can always come up and grab critical exploit, or you can just grab any of the damage within this region instead of traveling all the way down here. You could also grab some extra evasion. You could come in and grab reach and strike, and then come out the back to grab rapid strike. There's a ton of choices. I just like the skill speed. I think it feels cozy, and you get an extra 3% move speed and a jewel on top of it. So eventually I would say to come down here, because these nodes obviously feel good and jewels are just very, very powerful. Future developments would be to come in here and grab this jewel socket, potentially have a weapon swap that puts us into Kite Runner, so that we basically have a weapon swap that uses our Falling Thunder, and that way we can have these points and these points on the weapon swap. Not there yet, something we're definitely thinking about doing in the future, but it obviously requires 2 good weapons to make that function properly. Now, the final piece of the puzzle, as for any build guide, is the gear. I'm going to try and make this as easy to understand as possible, as the gearing is very flexible on this build. The main thing we spoke about is already the weapon. I explained the dream case weapon. Fizz, cold, attack speed, crit. That would be the best weapon, but just getting a decent weapon with high DPS is good to start. You can use an elemental weapon with really high DPS, absolutely fine. You don't need cold. As I said, if you get cold on other sources, there are other ways to fix your cold damage without having cold on the weapon. So if you get a really good deal on like a fire fizz staff, snap it up. You can make do with that. You can figure out the freeze another way with all the things I've shown you. For the helmet, it's important to get an energy shield base with higher energy shield and then life on it. And then for the suffixes, definitely want to get crit chance here, as it's not really possible to get on any other item other than your amulet, but our amulet slot is kind of taken. And the reason we want an energy shield base is for subterfuge mask. This gives us +2 evasion rating per 1 maximum energy shield on the equipped helmet. So getting an energy shield helmet is just better bang for your buck than getting a hybrid. And then we can also get things like rarity, crit, resistances. That's how I'd spend your affixes on the helmet. For the body armor, we want as much evasion as possible, as well as life, and then stats and resistance. There's not really anything on armor suffixes that you can get, so I'd go for stats and resistances exclusively, because you do need a stat roll somewhere. All attributes from your amulet does help, or if you're not using the unique amulet, you can obviously get all attributes on your amulet, on your rare amulet. But getting a stat roll in your chest is good, as well as any resistances you need. For rings, I am using breach rings, and this will be like kind of the ultimate endgame version, as we would use the ingenuity belt. I've only just picked this up. I've used the build up to this point without this belt. You absolutely can too. You don't have to use breach rings. They're by no means best in slot if they're not really well rolled. But one important thing about breach rings, and the reason that I'm using them, is 1, this belt exists, but 2, you can catalyze them 50 times to get 50% additional effect of any corresponding modifier to the quality that you've used. So for example, on this ring, I have cold. And so this scales any modifier with the cold tag by 50% more. That would be the cold damage to attacks, the elemental resistance, and the cold resistance. So I end up getting 48% cold res, 22 all res, and a nice chunk of cold damage from this ring. And then we also want life on top. The dream situation would be for the other two affixes to be rarity, but it'll be a while before they exist. This one is closer, of course. We have a fire version. You don't want both to be cold, or you're going to be massively overcapped on your resistance. But this one, I have fire, elemental, fire. You can see with the quality is fire, so we have the 3 mods being scaled. And then we have some rarity. Again, you don't need to use breach rings. You can absolutely get away with any ring. These are right now cosmetic because they're just solving res problems. Only when these become like really well-rolled, kind of best in slot breach rings would I be too concerned about them being actually breach rings, right? You can use any ring you like. Gloves are an interesting slot, as you can get things like flat damage added to attacks. You can get attack speed. You can get crit damage. But you can also get things like stats and res if you need them. Life, very good. Obviously, evasion, energy shield, very good. Rarity, very good. And then for boots, ideally you'd want 35% move speed, life, res, the normal stuff. There's not too interesting of mods on boots. This is just the best case. There are some power charge boots that are very good for damage, but you do drop a lot of movement speed and survivability, especially if you were to have like a good amount of evasion and energy shield on these, as well as a life roll. I don't have life on these. It's definitely a slot I need to upgrade. So I wouldn't use the unique boots with a power charge. Maybe for bossing, you could get away with those, but for mapping, I would never want to drop that movement speed. It's one of the worst parts about this build is its movement speed. You don't get around too quick. So I would never, ever, ever drop rare boots for the unique boots. Belt. There's no interest in belt mods on rare belts, to be honest. It's just life and res. You can get an additional charm if you like, but as I said, eventually I'm going to be using, well, eventually Ingenuity belt will probably be best in slot for this, and that's what I'm using. You can see it does massively overcut my res because I'm not fully built for it yet. I could eventually drop all the cold res on all my other gear. It does solve a lot of problems, gives me more life, gives me more rarity. This is the belt I'm going to go for. But as I say, I've used this belt for 99% of my playthrough. This rare one, you can too. Don't worry about having an 80% ingenuity. This is just because I farmed up and bought it. You can do that too. Next for gear, we will look at jewels. Jewels are very important for this build. You can get some very cool mods, like projectiles have a chance to chain an additional time from terrain. This is of course going to allow your Falling Thunder to keep bouncing off of walls and go find more mobs to kill. On top of that, critical hit chance for attacks is a very, very strong modifier, as it's important to reach that 50% mark. If you have a good weapon, you could maybe look at dropping the crit. It's going to make these jewels much cheaper if you don't have to get crit and like attack speed, or crit and chain. And then for the prefixes, just damage. I have about 250% increased damage baseline. Before like situational modifiers like this, 30% increased damage if you've dealt a crit late recently. I have 250 unconditional increased damage. So the actual increased damage you get from jewels is a significant amount of damage. For example, this 22% increased damage here, if we were to subtract that from my total damage of 250, I'd go down to what, like 228. So this 22% increased damage represents a 10% more multiplier to my damage. Before obviously all these conditional benefits, which there are a few of them to be fair. But increased damage on your jewels, very good. Crit, very good. Crit damage, also very good. This one is pretty much the same. If you can get them corrupted with like rares or stats, very good as well. But that's how they look. We have a rage jewel down here with area of effect. Area of effect is a pretty difficult stat to come by, so getting it on a red jewel with rage on hit is very nice. And the same goes for a blue jewel. We can get a blue jewel with crit, mana on kill, and area of effect. This allows us to drop the siphon node and still obviously not run out of mana. So if you do not have a jewel with this mod on it, please allocate this node or you will struggle with mana. And the final item we'll look at is the amulet. It is the serpent's egg. This is a few divines. You do not need it. This amulet makes it so that on average I will get 3 power charges when I proc my combat frenzy. Without this amulet you would gain 2. So it would take me 3 procs to get full 7 power charges. Now, the beauty of getting 3 on average is that when combined with this node down here, I can gain 3 of them twice, and because I have 7 total, that means that every 3.4 seconds, I can fire off a 7 projectile Falling Thunder. For you, this would be every 5.1 seconds, because you would need to proc it 3 times to get to 6, and then with 1 with the Storm, you would get the 7 power charge Falling Thunder. So the Amulet is definitely a good increase. It's not mandatory by any means. The only time it feels bad not to have this, I would say, would be in things like breaches, because that time between casting your Falling Thunders means a lot more in a breach because the mobs are coming at you so fast. But outside of that, if you're just leveling up or you're progressing your way through the Atlas, you won't need this whatsoever. This scales really well with juicy content and isn't mandatory below that. So that'll be it for the full, all the gear, the passive tree and all that. I hope this was digestible. I tried to make it as quick and snappy as possible. If you want to level this build in order to play it, there is a leveling guide on Maxroll that I will link in the description. I appreciate you all watching. I hope I've served you well with this build. It's kind of like my first ever PoE build that I've actually like, mothered, I guess, from start to finish and then tried helping people. So let me know how I did, but I hope you had a really good time playing it. So thanks for trusting me with your time if you have chosen to follow my build. I do apologize for changing it so frequently, but this is the nature of a new game and new things being found all the time. This should serve right now as a good foundation for where this build will go in the future. I don't plan on there being any wholesale changes to it. It will just be improving the individual pieces, jewels, as we go, maybe trying to fit in some cool unique jewels that might make us change the tree a little bit. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this helps you. If you have any questions of things that I may have missed, feel free to jump into stream and ask me, and I'll see you next time.